Hello. Today I'll be talking about grain exports to the USSR during the 1932 to 1933 period. Now, we've all heard the claim that as the Holodomor was going on, the USSR, and Stalin specific, because this claim is made to demonize him, the USSR kept exporting grain. The claim is that the USSR kept exporting grain despite parts of Ukraine starving, and hence the USSR and Stalin were horrible for doing so, socialism is evil, blah 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 blah. This is also used to fuel the claim that the Holodomor was a genocide or a man-made famine. This is a lie constantly parroted in history classes from middle school all the way up to the university level. In this video, I'll clearly demonstrate both how this claim is just outright false, and also the dishonest twisting of history the bourgeoisie resort to in order to paint the USSR in a negative light. Now, to get a full understanding of all the conditions, we need to go over some background history. In the early 1920s, the Soviet Union was still very young and very anxious to restore its pre-war industry, which had been completely destroyed after World War I and the Russian Civil War, and also build a new industry. They needed machinery, they needed equipment, oil, and many other things in order to create an industrial base from which production of goods and the construction of socialism could kick off of. The Tsarist Empire had left behind pretty much nothing at all. The Trans-Siberian Railway was a broken, rickety, one-way structure that had to be rebuilt from scratch. All the previous industrial sectors were working with worn-out, busted machinery, and the lack of refineries and advanced machines rendered the huge resources of the USSR practically useless. If they wanted to get anything done, they needed to buy almost everything, that being tools, fuels, machines, etc., from foreign, usually Western countries, as they didn't have the time or the money for the industrial base of the country to grow organically. Now, if they didn't have the money, then what could they offer? Well, they were able to offer only three things to the international market: grain, minerals, and gold. Now, in 1922, at the Genoa Conference, the new gold exchange standard was introduced. Since the end of 1922, the Soviet Union was issuing the golden chervonets, a new Soviet currency fully covered by the golden reserves and convertible to gold. In 1923, the Soviet chervonets was one of the most stable and secured currencies of the world. It represented a very clear and present danger for the emerging financial center of the world, the United States. Due to Western pressure, the Soviet chervonets was replaced by a ruble without golden equivalent in 1924. This reduced the threat the Soviets posed to the capitalist powers and their currencies, and in return, the Soviet Union was recognized by the UK, by Norway, by Greece, by France, by Austria, by Denmark, by Japan, by Mexico, by China, and many other countries. In 1925, the Soviet leadership decided to accelerate the industrialization of the country because, although they had surpassed Tsarist Russia in its industrial output, superseding the production level of 1913, they were nowhere near any of the previously mentioned countries in terms of development. The USSR was still relatively underdeveloped compared to the rest of the world, at least the Western world. However, as expected, this was not something the capitalist powers liked, and in 1925, a so-called golden blockade was imposed on the USSR. The Western powers refused to accept gold as payment for industrial equipment they delivered to the Soviet Union. They essentially demanded that Soviet government pay for everything, for all the equipment that they get, that they import from these Western capitalist powers, in timber, in oil, and in grain. In 1929, the U.S. bankers' lack of regulation initiated the Great Depression, I'm sure we're all aware, which brought on a period of international currency instability. In 1931, Germany and Austria failed to repay their foreign debt and stopped exchanging marks, which was their currency, into gold, thus abolishing the gold exchange standard. By autumn 1931, the UK suspended the gold exchange as well. Now this all seems unrelated, but just bear with me for a little bit. With this economic crisis at hand, the one thing that could have saved the Austrian banks was gold. Knowing this, it would be only logical to lift the golden blockade on the Soviet Union and allow Soviet gold to relieve the suffocating Western economies. But the decision they took was actually the absolute reverse. Not only did they leave the gold blockade on the USSR in place, but they also imposed a severe trade embargo on the majority of Soviet exports. Such embargoes were further introduced throughout the 30s, such as in April 17th of 1933, when the British government introduced the Russian Goods Import Prohibition Act of 1933. Now, some Soviet exports were embargoed, but the Soviets could still buy certain goods from the West. Here's the catch though, they demanded all payments be made in grain. The Soviet Union and the party knew that if they halted the 5-year plan and industrialization now, the West will only capitalize on this opportunity to crush them, so they decided to continue exporting grain. The Soviet Union needed it to industrialize to avoid being crushed, and hence continued to export grain so that industrialization wouldn't be stopped. If the Soviet Union was given a chance to pay in things other than just raw materials and grain, then this would have never been a problem. In fact, this was a political decision purposely made by the capitalist powers in an attempt to cripple the USSR by forcing it to offer its raw materials and grain. To quote the Russian economist Starikov, Having no other instruments to overthrow the undesirable communist regime, Western political and financial elites planned to instigate the internal unrest through, in particular, the artificial deficit of food in the Soviet state. Although, despite the fact that the USSR paid in grain to get all the machinery it needed, this does not mean that they exported grain to the point of intentionally starving people, as I will show in a little bit. The export data from the Soviet Union for those years proves this fact. In the year 1930, they exported 4,846,024 tons of grain. In 1931, the number increased to 5,182,835 tons of grain. In 1932, which is the year when the famine happened, they exported much, much less. In 1932, only 1,819,114 tons of grain were exported, which is a 65% reduction in the exports of grain. It doesn't end there, though. Not only did they reduce the export of grain by 2/3, but they also imported 750,000 tons during the first half of 1932, and from late April onwards, 157,000 tons. The amount of export in 1933 further decreased the next year, and another 200,000 tons of grain were imported. To claim that Stalin wanted to intentionally starve Ukrainians is sheer lunacy, and in fact, these claims only go to show the dishonesty of these so-called historians who continue to lie about the truth. They exported only a fraction of what they normally would have, and even imported over 1 million tons, and sent food aid when they realized the extent of the famine. Doesn't seem like much of a deliberate genocide now, does it? Also, the reason they even exported grain and various raw materials to begin with was because A, the Western powers forced them to, because they would only accept grain or raw materials as a form of payment, and B, that this is one of the few options all underdeveloped agrarian and semi-feudal countries have. The Soviet Union in particular had a good reason for it because they were trying to get the necessary capital to industrialize and not only escape backwardness forever, which they did, but also to build a strong industrial base which could prevent them from destruction by foreign powers. In the end, this industrialization is what beat the Nazis. The industrialization was a marvelous feat and is a particularly impressive event considering that they had no access to foreign loans, no colonies to steal wealth from, and no slave labor to exploit, which was the case with pretty much every capitalist power. Now, despite this, there was a delay in halting exports and in sending aid to the affected regions. Why did this happen? Well, initially the Soviet leadership in Ukraine, which relayed info to Moscow, was not fully aware of the famine's extent. It really is as simple as that. Stanislav Kosyur, secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine, wrote to Moscow in order to inform them regarding the course of the perspectives of the sowing campaign in Ukraine. This letter was sent during March of 1932. Stalin replied to his letter with this: "The Political Bureau believes that shortage of seed grain in Ukraine is many times worse than what has been described in Comrade Kosyur's telegram. Therefore, the Political Bureau recommends the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine to take all measures within its reach to prevent the threat of failing to sow field crops in Ukraine." Signed, Secretary of the Central Committee, Joseph Stalin. Kosyur replied with, "There are isolated cases of starvation and even whole villages starving. However, this is only the result of bungling on the local level, deviations from the party line, especially in regard to kolkhozes. All rumors about famine in Ukraine must be unconditionally rejected. The crucial help that was provided for Ukraine will give us the opportunity to eradicate all such outbreaks of starvation." To which Stalin immediately responded that same very day with this: "Comrade Kosyur, you must read the attached summaries. Judging by this information, it looks like the Soviet authority has ceased to exist in some parts of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Can this be true? Is the situation in villages in Ukraine this bad? Where are the operatives of the OGPU, that being the Joint Main Political Directorate? What are they doing? Could you verify this information and inform the Central Committee of all Union Communist Parties about taken measures? Sincerely, Joseph Stalin." Now, reading this, it is obviously incorrect to claim that there was an intentional starving campaign of Ukrainians and that the Soviet authorities knew what was going on full-heartedly. In fact, the situation was confused, telegrams and letters were sent back and forth in order to clear up what was going on, and when it all became clear, exports were drastically reduced, food started to be imported, and relief was sent to the affected areas. Another claim made is that Stalin had held large grain reserves but had not used them to relieve the affected areas of the USSR, and in particular Ukraine. This is also factually not true, as Stalin had insisted on the formation of grain reserves of up to 2 to 3 million tons of grain, but these attempts were completely unsuccessful due to a myriad of reasons. This video has been going on for long enough now, so if you're really interested in this final claim, all the sources are in the description as always. And that's it for this video. Thank you for watching.